Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. It's an absolute delight and an honor to be here. So I'm here for 2 weeks at Baptist University at the Raozongyi Academy of Sinology. I was there last year as well, so I'm supposed to come for 2 weeks a year for 3 years. And last year, I was here in early or mid-November, just about the same time of the year. And one day I was free, and I said, well, I've heard that the Chicago campus is about to open, so I came over and walked up the hill to see this. And of course, like everybody else, when you walk onto the roundabout there and then you look out at the harbor and you look at the glass tree house, you just go, wow. It hadn't been opened yet. I think the grand opening was right at the end of November, maybe November 30th. And by that time I was back in Chicago. But we did take advantage of the campus in September. So one of the books that I had a big role in 20 years ago is called The Cambridge History of Ancient China. And that book has never been translated. And because it's never been translated, people in China think that it's a very special book. If ever they saw a translation, they might find that it's just an ordinary book. But because you know whatever you can't see is what you value the most. So there's a notion that this is a very important book, and it actually the Cambridge history does set the standard for studies of ancient China. And by ancient China, I mean the period from the Shang dynasty down to the Qin unification of China. So basically from 1200 to 200 BC. And this year being the 20th anniversary, we thought that it would be a good occasion to have a conference to look back on the 20 years on the creation of this book and also the reception of the book. And I also had a plan to have 2 different conferences, or maybe one conference that would take place in 2 different venues. So we started in Beijing at the Chicago Center there and had a group of about a dozen Western scholars joined by 18 scholars from all over China, so mainland China. The language of that conference was Chinese, was Mandarin. Then we came down to Hong Kong on the high-speed train. I remember the first train I took from Hong Kong north. I was on the train for 31 hours and never made it to Beijing, but this was Beijing to Hong Kong in 8.5 hours. And I brought a group of 9 younger scholars from various universities in Europe and America. And then we had another 2 days of conference here on the Hong Kong campus, where we were joined by another 15 or so scholars based in Hong Kong. And this conference was, the lingua franca was English. I had a chance to come back to the campus, and at that time met Mark, and I was dumbfounded that the executive director of this campus sat through 2 days of very technical conference, and enjoyed it apparently. So we've gotten to know each other, and as I say, I'm here for 2 weeks now, and then somehow we got in touch and said, okay, well, let's do a talk. And I'm very grateful that all of you came out on an evening such as this for this kind of talk. Westerners, when they begin to study things Chinese, one of the first things they learn is that there's apparently a Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. Now, I've never heard this curse in Chinese at all, and we've asked people, nobody's ever heard this, but it's part of the tradition that this is, may you live in interesting times. And these, of course, in Hong Kong are very interesting times right now. But we all made it, and so want to do something that's semi-entertaining, rather than trying to give a really detailed technical study of a new manuscript or something else. I thought, because this book was just published in Shanghai in September, and in fact, truth be told, I did a talk such as this in Shanghai in September. They had a book launch. Of course, that was in Chinese. This is in English, but I get to recycle the talk and think about it. And there, what they wanted me to do was to give a little retrospective of my own work. And so that's what we'll do tonight. Mark said I've spent a good part of my career at Chicago. No, I've spent my entire career at Chicago. I've been there 35 years now, and I would guess that there are only a handful of faculty members who've been there longer than I have. But this will look back even before I got to Chicago, back to the time when I was a student and a graduate student, and then follow things down to more or less the present day. So as Mark said, this book was translated. So he mentioned that I write most of my own work in Chinese. And one of the reasons I'm here for this 2-week period is we were supposed to have a book launch on Friday at Hong Kong Baptist University, because they're publishing a new book of mine, but it's not quite a new book. It was published last year also in Shanghai, but with Shanghai Guji Chubanshe. And it was an overview of Western studies of Chinese paleography. So works on oracle bone inscriptions, bronze inscriptions, and bamboo and silk manuscripts. When that was published, this is one of my students, David Leibovitz, his boss at he's just started a postdoc at Baptist U, and his boss there said, "Oh, we should translate this book that you wrote in Chinese into English and publish it." No, we don't want someone else to translate so I translated it myself. And then we had the absurd situation of me being a Lao Wai, writing in Chinese and then translating my own book into English. The book launch has been canceled for Friday because we're living in interesting times. This one was sort of in the opposite direction. I published a book about 25 years ago, 22 years ago. This one before Confucius, Studies in the Creation of the Chinese Classics. And as Mark said, it has eight studies in it, mainly devoted to the 3 of the first Chinese classics, or sometimes called the Confucian classics, the Zhouyi, or the Changes, the classic of changes, the Shangshu, the classic of history, the Shijing, classic of poetry. I also had published most of those in Chinese. Most of those 6 out of the 8 studies I had published in various journals in mainland China. But in about 2005 or so, someone at Academia Sinica, the director of what's called their Institute of Chinese Literature and Philosophy, said he wanted to start a new series of translations of Western books on the Chinese classics. and he wanted to translate this as the first installment in that series. And I said, no, you don't want to translate it. I've already written most of it in Chinese. No, we're going to translate it. We're going to translate it. And so he had a couple of students starting to work on it. They worked for 2 years or so and sent me the translation. And as I was reading it, I wanted to cry. It was and so I spent probably 6 months correcting every sentence, sent it back, and then a year or so later, it came back to me, and some of those corrections had been incorporated, others, new mistakes had entered into this. The whole process of publishing this book took something like 6 years. But it was eventually published in Taiwan in 2013 with this title, 孔子之前. I thought that it would have a big market in China because right at that time, China, this is right when Xi Jinping had come into power and was starting to talk about Confucius. We started having ceremonies at Confucian temples. And I thought that people would be interested in this. And then I found out Taiwan books are not available on the mainland. It's very hard to get them. And so this went on a couple of years. And then by 2017, said, well, what do we do about this? Fortunately, the copyright in Taiwan is very short. It's only 5 years. So I talked to the publisher in Taiwan. He said, just wait one more year, really, until 2018, and the copyright will expire, and then you can just republish the book in mainland China. And whoops, that's this book here that was just published, as I said. The main difference, although we managed to correct some of the mistakes and put a new preface, but of course, the main difference is that it's in simplified characters, right? So, this book is old. So not only is it 22 years ago that it was published in 1997 in America, but it's a collection of articles. And some of the articles were written even when I was still a graduate student. So in the early 1980s. And even the latest of the articles was written in the early 1990s. So it goes back 35 years, even more than 35 years. So I thought in introducing the book, it'd be an opportunity just to look back on myself. And just a little background. Before I ever became a graduate student, I went off to Taiwan and was in Taiwan for only a year or so when I ended up studying with this man on the left. So I was just telling Mark, I Ching, and that's a strange name for Chinese. He's not Chinese, obviously. This is the Manchu royal family. He was one of the elders of his banner of the Manchu royal family. Taken to Taiwan in 1947, kept in, maybe appropriate to mention him here, this was a prison for a while. He was kept in house arrest for about 10 years after he was taken to Taiwan. And then little by little, he started teaching, and teaching, at first, he was allowed to teach foreigners. And so by the time I started studying with him, he had already had almost 20 years of experience of teaching foreigners, though he didn't know any English, although maybe he knew a little English. He once was rocking in his chair and he said, "You speak English, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, I knew English once. And I said, oh yeah? He said, yes. Big nose was his, about the extent of his knowledge of English. But we read the classics together. And that's where I started working on the I Ching. I read the I Ching, the Classic of Changes, with him twice for about 2 years, 8 hours a week, and kept going back to Taiwan while he was still alive. He lived to a very ripe old age. He lived to 106. And he kept teaching until 3 weeks before he finally passed away. But in 2005, I went back for his 100th birthday and took some pictures with him. But what I want to show, let's see, how do I do this now? Mark, you're going to do this. We'll have a little video, just a couple minutes. Yeah. So he was born in Beijing, obviously, and you've all heard the story of how Puyi, the last emperor, when he was about 5 years old, and they started to bring the grand tutor to start his education. And he said, well, I've heard that in the West, little boys go to school and study with other little boys. And they said, but you're the emperor, you don't do that. And he said, no, I want to study with other little boys. So they brought about 5 Manchu noblemen into the Gugong to have classes together with him. And this is why his teachers are all the most famous teachers of the late Qing dynasty and early Republican period. So he studied in the imperial palace with Puyi for a couple of years. We're going to hear some of his teaching, and just for 2 minutes. So many of these names, I'm sure, are familiar to all of you, or most of you in any event. And we're going to hear him coming down. He ended his life living in a building in Taipei and had a big classroom in the basement, sort of like this basement, but it was just a concrete floor, and he lived on the floor above. There's the door closing on the floor above, and he's walking down the steps now.
What 什么叫凤元？我们的同学，如果心地不干净，不配做凤元书院的学生。
So the name of his academy
园
is
里
Fengyuan Shuyuan.
头一点肮脏都没有。中国的书多到不可限量。我问问你们，你们这么大年龄了，你们读几本书？哪一个人懂一本书？怎么能用得上？将来我们这个孔学是怎么用这孔学，不是怎么讲这孔学，还讲孔学。 古书讲的都好，就是我们看不懂。你要懂得怎么能用，就是证明你看懂了。
I think you get the idea. This video was shot about 3 years before he died, and at that point, his students, he'd have about 100 students from Taida and Zhengzhi who would come and sit in the basement. I don't know how many of them really understood much of what he was saying. Towards the end of his life, he'd lost all but 3 teeth, and so it was a little hard for him to speak. But you know, he was the last remnant of the Qing dynasty, and so people wanted to go and see the performance. This goes on for another 10 minutes, but unfortunately, in this audience, I don't have to translate what he's saying. But how many books have you read? And it's not just a matter of reading them and talking about them, but rather how do you use them? How do you make use of these books? So I'm going to confess that he was quite proud of me, but he would have been appalled at the way I use these books. And I'll talk about this in a little bit. But so I was in Taiwan for 3 years, and then finally started graduate school. And I went to Stanford, not to the University of Chicago, but to Stanford, and studied with this gentleman, David Nivison. And it was there that I got interested. I told him that I wanted to study the classic of changes, the I Ching. And he said, you know, that's just a bunch of nonsense. Why would you do that? Even though he was interested in philosophy, he said the I Ching is just crazy talk. But while I was there, we got interested in unearthed materials. He was starting to study oracle bone inscriptions, so I studied oracle bone inscriptions with him, bronze inscriptions, and so the rest is kind of history about the study of that. And as I say, by the early 1980s, started writing articles that were sometimes written in English, sometimes in Chinese. But one of the things that I was trying to do with almost all of the articles was to merge not so much Western notions and Chinese notions, but rather to merge unearthed materials, archaeological materials, with transmitted literature. What really makes me happy is when I can find a chance to either use transmitted literature to explain some new text that's just been dug out of the ground, or else to use that new text that's been dug out of the ground to explain some problem either that we thought we had with transmitted materials, or maybe even problems that we never even knew existed. So there are lots of those that we thought, this is certainly the way we understand this text. And then we find out that people in antiquity understood that text very differently. The contents that most of you can read on the left-hand side of the screen, but here there are 2 chapters each on the classic of changes, the classic of documents, and the classic of poetry, and then another one on a historical text that's similar to the classic of history, and then another one on the Bamboo Annals, which is a text that I've written several studies of, and with which I'm somewhat identified, both in China and the West. Now, I had another teacher while I was in graduate school who was at Berkeley. So Stanford and Berkeley are about 60 miles apart. And at first I would make the trip 2 days a week from Stanford up to Berkeley. And then I said, no, this is not the way I want to live my life. I moved to San Francisco and spent more time at Berkeley than I did at Stanford, actually. And David Keatley was the foremost authority on oracle bone inscriptions. And we became very close. He just passed away 2 years ago. Until the end of his life, we were very close friends. But when I told him what I wanted to do for my doctoral dissertation, which was to study the I Ching, the classic of changes, he too said, no, why would you do this? One of the first things that aspiring sinologists in the West are told, don't study the I Ching, don't try to translate the Lao Tzu, and don't come up with a new Romanization system. Well, I've done most of those three don'ts. But David Keatley said, this is really misguided. What we should be doing now is studying new things, new material that's archaeologically excavated, and there's no reason to study these old books. You know, the old books are already known. I didn't think so. And in 2005, we saw a picture of me when I was visiting Yulao, the way he's usually referred to, in Taiwan, on his 100th, sort of the year that he turned 100. We were down in his basement talking, and at a certain point he said, yeah, I heard that on the mainland they found a new text of the I Ching. I had just translated it. And I said, yes, there is such a thing. And I knew that he wasn't going to be very happy with it. But he got up and he almost ran across the room to a bookshelf, and he came back. This is a manuscript that's in the possession of the Shanghai Museum. And if you've ever seen these manuscripts, these collections as they're published, they're in big folio volumes, about maybe a little over a half a meter high, and they're very heavy. And here's this 100-year-old man who comes back and he says, this is the book that they say is the I Ching. And he got back to where I was, and then he threw it on the floor and he said, this is not our I Ching. 这不是咱们的易经，不是孔子的易经，不是周公的易经, and threw it down on the ground, saying that we don't need these things. Because for him, he had a notion of Chinese tradition that was perfect, that he'd been taught as a child, and everything was in its proper place, and there was no room for anything new. And so archaeology, for this teacher of mine, was a meaningless exercise. So I didn't tell him that I had just translated. He sort of knew, but so my two teachers, or two of my three teachers, one in Berkeley, one in one in Taiwan, both really discouraged me from doing the kind of work that I do. But I'm very disobedient, a very unfilial student, and pay no attention to them. So today, just for the fun of it, I want to just cover two of the studies in this. One which is on the I Ching, which I've talked about a lot, and the other one is on just one poem of the Shijing, which is just for the fun of it. So most of you have at least looked at the I Ching, and you certainly know that the first two hexagrams are Qian and Kun, and that the I Ching is made up of these symbols of 6 lines of either broken or solid lines, and that Qian is identified with heaven or with something that's very energetic, vigorous. It is 6 unbroken lines, which is to say 6 yangyao. And and Kun, on the other hand, is identified with earth or with following things, with being docile, and it's 6 broken lines. And the text is made up of a hexagram statement and then short statements on each of the lines. So we'll leave this here. I don't know, which should we deal with, the Chinese, or there is my English translation. Most of you will know that Qian hexagram is all about this dragon. So the first line, and you read the hexagrams from the bottom to the top. And the first line is usually identified with incipience, with youth, the beginning of things. And then you grow old as you move up the hexagram until you get to the very top, which is old age and decline. We have the dragon is the prime image used in most of the lines of this, starting with a submerged dragon. And then you see the dragon in the fields and now jumping in the depths. Even though it doesn't mention the dragon here, it's clear just from the rhyme scheme that this is also about the dragon. And then you've all heard of Fei Long Zai Tian, the flying dragon in the skies. It's one of the most auspicious images that you have in all of Chinese literature. And then something weird about Wanglong. Wanglong, what does that mean? Throated dragon. And people have explained the dragon in all sorts of different ways. The dragon, of course, is an animal. Maybe it's talking about an animal, but then there's always a debate whether or not the dragon exists. People have debated it very vigorously in ancient China. But of course, it's also a symbol of the emperor or the king. So we know in Hong Kong, right, Jiulong, why, when you only have 8 mountains, why is it Jiulong instead? Because the emperor had come, the emperor of the Ming Dynasty had come here. Or it could just be a junzi, a gentleman or a scholar. It's a symbol for that. Lots of different understandings. And the wonderful thing about the I Ching is that nobody really knows what it means. So we can always be free to give it new meanings. And I was in graduate school listening to my teacher, David Nivison, talk to another student about astronomy. And when they were talking about astronomy, I realized that this dragon, even though there is no dragon that walks the earth, but there is a dragon that flies through the Chinese skies. And that's in the Chinese zodiac, you know, the 4 spiritual animals or the 28 lunar lodges. And there is the eastern 6 lodges or 7 lodges are the Tonglong or Qinglong, the dragon. Let's skip this. And that's what it looks like. This is what the Tonglong dragon looks like in the sky. And it's made up of 6 of these lunar lodges, and you can see that the 6 lodges are the idea of a dragon in China is very different from the dragon in the West, which breathes fire, right? This dragon is like a long serpentine creature, but always with 2 horns on the head. And you've seen dragon dances, and the 2 horns are there. And those are 2 stars, Spica, which is a very important star, in the sky, and another one to match it because we need two stars. The next is the throat, and then you have sort of the chest cavity of the dragon, and then the fang and shin, of course, are the shin obviously is the heart of the dragon. And then you have this tail, which corresponds almost exactly to what we in the West, or what Western people see as Scorpio, the scorpion. But this is, in China, it's just the tail of the dragon. That's where the dragon is. If that is a dragon, can we understand submerged dragon? Why is it submerged? Well, the I Ching, one of the things about the 6 lines of each hexagram is that they're correlated with time. Correlated with the time of one's life. So from infancy through old age, but also correlated with the months of the year in many ways, starting from the beginning of Yang, which starts in about December, and then grows until we have full-bloomed Yang in the summer, and then you go past that. And in December, what we find that in 800 BC, roughly when the I Ching was written, in December at dusk, when astronomical sightings were taken, this dragon, dragon constellation, was under the horizon, couldn't be seen. And of course, under the horizon in Chinese mythology is water. If you dig a tomb, you very quickly find that you hit water. And this then led to the idea that the yellow springs, the Huangquan, are under the ground. And the dragon in the wintertime is living there. When we come to the second line, about March, many of you will have heard an old saying, 2月2龙抬头, so that on the second day of the second month, the dragon's head pops up. And this is, of course, an old saying, but I think it also means that right at this time, about the 3rd month of the agricultural calendar, the dragon first appears. The two horns of this jiao appear above the eastern horizon. The next sort of really important movement that the dragon constellation makes is over the course of 2 more months. It first seems to be fairly stable, and then by late April, early May, it suddenly seems as if it's jumping up. You can see here that at first only the neck is above the horizon, and then by late April, suddenly much of the body of the dragon, including the heart, is now visible above the horizon. So as if it's jumping in the depths. The fifth line, this famous line, 飞龙在天, flying dragon in the heavens, is obviously the time when Yang, the creative principle, is at its peak. And this is right at the summer solstice. And if you look at the night sky, not now we can't see the sky because there's too much ambient light. But in 800 BC, people didn't have television, so they watched the stars. And the stars told great stories to them. And in late June of 800 BC, if you looked up, you saw this dragon arrayed all across the sky. And that tells you this is the height of the growing season. This is when everything is at its peak. Things get to their peak, and then, of course, they begin to decline. In the case of the dragon, it goes back under the horizon on the other side of the sky, on the western horizon. And we have this strange line at the very top of the hexagram that it's Wanglong. And people say Gang means arrogant, 骄傲. But why? And the word Gang actually refers to the throat. And it's, of course, the throat of that dragon constellation. And we find that in late August, early September, that, in fact, that constellation is right on the western horizon. And I think that has to be what that Wanglong refers to. And then Qiangua is a very strange, Qian and Kun are the only two hexagrams that have an extra line, and the extra line of Qian hexagram is see the flock of dragons without heads. 见群龙无首. Why does it not have a head? Because, of course, from this time on, the head very quickly dips under the horizon. And you see the tail of the dragon still up in the sky, but the head is under the ground. So that's, I think, what Qian hexagram originally, what the people who created that were originally thinking about. I could go on and talk about Kungwa and lots more numerology and mythology, but I see that the time is moving on, and if we're to get to the Shijing at all, which is kind of fun, I'm going to skip this and talk about. Talk about one poem of the Shijing. And this poem has never really been published anywhere except in this book, or at least my understanding of the poem. Probably for good reason. Probably because most people would think Shaughnessy's just playing around with this. This really isn't an appropriate kind of understanding. But it's bear with me. We'll just read through it and see if it makes sense to you in a Confucian context and then in a post-Confucian context or a pre-Confucian context. So the poem is right at the beginning of the Shijing. It's the 10th poem in the whole collection. It's called Ru Fen. Ru Fen means the banks of the Ru River which flows from sort of central Henan into Anhui province. And the story goes that this is written at the time of King Yuen and King Wu at the very beginning of the Western Zhou dynasty, when they're about to conquer the Shang dynasty. And so their Dao, their way, is transforming people's morals. So this is the transformation of King Yuen, even extends to the states that are off in the east. These are sort of non-Zhou states. And wives, or at least a wife, is able to encourage her husband to go off to war, but also to go off to war but not be too violent, to be correct, to be upright. And here's the poem. So, first two stanzas, very, very sort of typical Shijing poem, following the bank of the Ru, chopping twigs and stems, chopping firewood. I haven't seen my junzi, my husband, my lover, something like that. 逆如肘击, I'm yearning like the morning hunger. So this is supposed to be a story about the wife whose husband is in the army. He's off attacking the Shang capital. And because collecting firewood is really something that the man is supposed to do, but since he's off at war, it's the wife who's doing it. And she's thinking about her husband. She'd like to see him. Standard. We see it in a dozen or more poems in the Shijing, that Wei Jianjun's, and then the next stanza is Ji Jianjun's, not yet seeing my lover, now I see him and everything is good. So the second stanza is that, but she's off again along the banks of the Ru River, and now she's cutting this tiaoyi. This is said to be sort of regrowth. So the story is that this is a year later. So she's still cutting the firewood because this military campaign has taken a long time. But finally, her husband comes home. And, you know, 不我下妻, he didn't leave me behind. All fine. Everyone can understand this. Except the third stanza. We have this 防御成为 王室如会 随着如会 父母空迷. So the Bream has a ruddy tail. The king's chamber's as if ablaze. Even though it's as if ablaze, father and mother are very near. How did we get a fish into this? You know, and this is a story about a wife chopping wood and waiting for her husband to come home. And now that he's come home, she's happy. But now the royal chamber is on fire. And even though it's on fire, father and mother are very near. What does that have to do with anything above? Well, we're told that the bream, which is a beautiful fish, it's a fish that is highly prized. It's supposed to be delicious to eat. It still is. But in the Shijing tradition, it says that when this fish has to swim against the current, its tail turns red. So this is an indication that the husband was off at war and was swimming against the current, and that's why there's a red tail. Zheng Xuan in the Han Dynasty says that in times of chaos, maybe we don't want to talk about times of chaos, right? So the fish also turns red. But there was a wonderful scholar in the first part of the 20th century, the most creative scholar, I think, in the whole 20th century, who actually spent some time in Chicago. So he got to Chicago. This is Wen Yiduo. Wen Yiduo, really great scholar. Went to Chicago and went to the School of the Art Institute in 1920. And if you know Hyde Park, you probably know the Medici, the restaurant that used to claim that Obama ate there. But right next to the Medici, there was a place that used to be a pizza parlor, but Wen Yiduo lived on the second floor of that building on 57th Street between Kimbark and Kenwood. He was first a poet and then a painter, and then he came back to China and had lots of children, and he needed to support them, so he got a job as a professor. Can you imagine? There was a time when professors were well paid. Well, I shouldn't say that in the business school, right? I mean, the business school professors are well paid. The rest of us, I don't know. In any event, he wrote a book on the Shijing, and he had this, one of the first essays in his collected writings is called On Fish, 说鱼. And he suggests that every time you see a fish in Chinese poetry, it's a sexual image. It always refers to sex in some way. And he also said that this Wei Jianjunzi, Ji Jianjunzi is a trope that you find over and over again in poems of love, of romance. And this idea of ni ru zhou ji, of yearning like the morning hunger. He says hunger is also a sexual longing, a hunger. He also has this notion that when people are chopping firewood, that firewood is a symbol for romance, that it starts the fires of love, right? This is all very creative, and it's fun. He makes all of these suggestions about other poems. He doesn't talk about this particular poem, Rufan, that I'm talking about here. Let me just make sure that I haven't missed. Here's this yearning like the hunger of dawn. This poem, if we had time, but you want me to end at 7, right? 4 minutes from now. I will race. This is a poem. This is a great poem. I love this poem. It's called Horan. Horan, which means either the second and third character. It can either mean men at waiting, so people who are sort of officers in the army, or waiting on a man. And this is a poem about a girl who sees the army come marching in, and they're all in their fancy uniforms, and she sees one guy, and he looks nice. So he's carrying his spear and everything. And there are 300 of them who come marching in. And then the next stanza goes to, there's a pelican on the bridge who doesn't wet his wings. And that young guy over there doesn't match his clothing. What does that mean? Well, pelicans, we know, are birds that eat fish. Okay? And Wanidua loves this poem because fish refers to sex, refers to love, romance. But this bird, who's supposed to eat fish, doesn't do so. And so the guy is standoffish. He doesn't want to deal with the girls who are looking at him. And then in the next stanza, there's a pelican on the bridge who doesn't wet his beak. So not only does he not put his whole body in the water to catch a fish, he doesn't even put his mouth, his beak in the water. And that young man over there doesn't pursue his date. This go also is a word that has to do with sexual congress, with sexual union. And then we have the final stanza of this, where the southern mountain, but then we have a reference to the girl, 惋惜惋惜 妓女四季. You know, she's so cute, she's so lovely, she's so hungry. She doesn't want her breakfast. She wants the guy to pay attention to her. We also have another poem. What's this about? Father and mother are very close. There's another poem at the beginning of the Shijing called Yeojin. So in the wilds, there's a dead deer. And there's this deer that's dead. Of course, you can imagine all sorts of symbolic meaning of a deer that's dead, right? And we wrap it up with white rushes, and there's a girl who Huaichun. Probably don't have to say too much about what cherishing spring-like feelings when life is surging. You know, we're in the springtime of our life and we're thinking about romance. And then there's a 纪实修之. there's a lucky guy who's sort of seducing her. And then we have there's a dead deer once again, and it says there's a girl like Jade. Jade is a very nice kind of object, but it also has all sorts of symbolic meaning throughout Chinese tradition. We'll let it go at that. And then we get to the last stanza of this poem. And we have this line, 虚而脱脱兮，无干我睡兮，吾是忙也非. Slow, go slow, don't touch my girdle. This is the, what's that movement in America that are all over the world now? You have to ask before you can touch someone. Don't touch my girdle. And then, me too, that's it. You too, right? Me too? Me too. Fortunately, I'm so old that I don't have to worry about those things anymore. And then the last line, don't get the dog barking. Don't make the dog bark. Why do you not want the dog to bark? Because mother and father are very close, and they'll find out what we're doing here. So there's a dead deer in the woods, right? Now, what's this? The king's chamber is as if ablaze. Well, this word Wang, that you all know, as king. But in ancient China, these two words, Wang and Yu, Jade, and Jade, I said, has all sorts of connotations in the Chinese language. And for periods from antiquity down to the modern day, the word jade is very commonly an adjective for private things. But in ancient China, this character was not Wang, but rather Yu. Wang was written this way, so the middle stroke was elevated closer to the top. It was only in the Han Dynasty that the middle stroke of Wang was brought down to the sort of equidistance from the top and bottom. And then to differentiate it from Jade, they added a dot, which is just there to make this difference. So I note here at the bottom of this, in various kinds of medieval text, we have Yuen, the jade gate, or Yuhu, the jade chamber, jade window. These are references to the female sexual organs. To what extent could someone in the Han Dynasty reading an ancient form of this poem see the character written, which in the Han Dynasty would be read as Wang, Wang Shi, Ru Hui, but originally it should have been read as Yu Shi. The jade chamber is as if ablaze. And without even changing a stroke, can turn this poem, that's just a poem about lovemaking, into a political comment. So now we go from jade to the royal chamber, and it's on fire and so forth. And that, of course, is what Confucian hermeneutics did to so many of the ancient classics, that found a political meaning for them. Now, go 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The very first article that I ever published, I ended it, the last paragraph, and I was not really conscious of this until my advisor, David Nivison, pointed out that what I had done says that, I wrote this, that modern scholars are justifiably excited when a bronze vessel bearing an inscription is unearthed. But earth, the soil, is not the only thing that can bury authentic records. In the case of this particular text that I was talking about, a different one, Confucian idealism has been nearly as obscurant. Starting from the Mencius, he said that this particular text, the Shifu chapter of the Yizhou, he said, if you believed everything of the Shangshu, it would be better not to have anything of the Shangshu. We'd be better off not having these texts. And because of that, this text was put away. People didn't read it anymore. So, and I was very youthful in those days, and so have this sort of charge to people. Let us not succumb to our own prejudices against unattested evidence, but instead examine the text just as we would a newly discovered bronze inscription. And it will tell us much about the early Zhou dynasty. That's what I've tried to do throughout my, my career, is, number one, to look at newly unearthed materials, archaeological materials. They really have reinvigorated the field of ancient China studies. They're what's so much fun about it. But I don't want to stop there. I always want to use those texts to try and reread the classics, to reread the Confucian classics. And I think when you do that, when you do it with sort of fresh eyes, there's much that we can still learn. Even though my other teacher, Yu Lao in Taiwan, said the classics are perfect. They don't need to be reinterpreted. But I still find things that I can find of interest that at least make them of interest to me. And so that's what this book was put together to do back in 1997, and then translated in 2013, and then just published 2 months ago in Shanghai, Kongzi Zhiqian. So that's something of the afterlife of before Confucius. So thank you very much.